Hi, everybody. It's Susan here, and I'm back with the lunar penumbral eclipse. It's a full moon in Libra, and that's at 5 degrees and 13 arc minutes of a degree for the eclipse point. Or if we want to backtrack 6 arc minutes, it's the full moon point at 5 degrees and 7 minutes. So I'm using the eclipse chart, and that's why the moon and the sun are not exactly opposite, but I don't think you'd notice that with the naked eye. And I just want to confirm I use the tropical zodiac for those of you who still wonder. And I'm also using a whole sign chart system, which I also use in my consulting practice, my consultations with clients. I find it gives the clearest results. And so that's what we're using today. This is, as all full moons, an opportunity to realize, to become aware of something in the area of Libra that we find in your chart. I will go sign by sign, and you'll find your sign for the sun and the moon and the ascendant. And this will be especially strong for ascendant signs, but it is a lunar eclipse. And I think lunar eclipses, although often on a world scale are less impactful, in a personal situation, the lunar eclipse can be very, very powerful. And especially because the moon represents our emotions, it represents our mind. It's about our home as well. We can relate that to women, especially older women, our mothers, mother figures, nurturing, food, all those kinds of things that we really need to sustain us. And so we'll have a look sign by sign. And just to start off, I'll just go through the chart and the main features of the chart from the point of view of the moment of the eclipse. Now, it's a penumbral eclipse. That means partial shade. Ombre, in Latin, ombre or umbral is the shade. We hear that in French and in Italian and other Latin-based languages much more powerfully than in English, but it just means that there's a chunk taken out of the moon where normally it would be round, and in the sky at least it's not flat, it is a sphere, but it would look a little bit like a cookie with a bit taken out of it, for example. Now this is about a 10-degree difference, and that's why there is only a partial eclipse happening. So you can certainly describe it as a partial eclipse, but because it's a lunar eclipse, the word penumbral is the formal way of calling this. Nonetheless, it's still within the range of eclipses. 10 degrees is still close by to the moon, and that means that the moon is being affected by the south node. And the south node, or K2, is what we are shedding, what we're leaving behind, or what we need to move away from. This can be something that happens through circumstances, and it can also be something that, especially with regards to the moon, can be something we're feeling and it's building for some time. It's time to move on. It's time to let go. It's time to separate from a particular connection or something that used to feel important, whether that's a relationship or a belief or even physical objects, values, this kind of thing, and particularly strongly because we're talking about Libra. uh, this is also just a little while after, very shortly after, the moon will have been trining Pluto. So the moon entered into Libra in a trine to Pluto, and this indeed is the first eclipse that we're having with Pluto involved in Aquarius. It's worth noting that in the September, so it's the 18th of September, and the 2nd of October eclipses later than this year, Pluto will be back in Capricorn. So this is a kind of an unusual spring. The next two eclipses that we have, first in Libra and then in Aries, will include Pluto in Aquarius. And then the energy changes again as we get to the end of the year. Also, this particular moon, in terms of the nakshatras in the Indian astrology system, what is known as Jyotish, which means the light, or the practice of researching the light, or the science of light, studying light. The moon as well as the south node are in what is called Hasta nakshatra. And Hasta nakshatra is a very interesting place for the moon and tends to bring some really interesting results. Those results can be even material. They can be worldly, we could call them results. But when the south node is with the moon, that's not going to be so easy. They're almost like two opposite meanings, and the south node is considered the enemy of the moon in Indian astrology because indeed it takes bites out of the moon, and sometimes completely. And so, we have this energy that is a little conflictual in terms of our goals or realizations or the things that we're understanding about our emotional situation, our home situation, our relationship to what we need to feel well and looked after in the Libra part of our chart. Since the South Node has been in this part of Libra since last July 2023, we're kind of familiar with this energy, except that it's not been in Hasta that whole time. It's just now moving into Hasta as in the last few weeks as we go through the early part of 2024, and it will only be staying in Hasta until I think it's November. Anyway, so it'll still be there in the next eclipses. It's just that the energies will be changing, of course, all around that. Now, the eclipse of the 2nd of October, which is the total solar eclipse. Sorry, it's a partial. Sorry, another partial solar eclipse, but it's still very close. Where we have this very strong eclipse in Libra at the new moon on the 2nd of October. Then we find a 10-degree eclipse there, where Ketu will have moved, or the south node will have moved beyond the moon, and this time we're finding that the south node is approaching the moon, or the moon is approaching the south node. They're coming together because they're moving in different directions. So we're in a phase where you can start to imagine that what's going on in your life here in March is going to be reflected in October. And I always like to try and pull in these time scales because they do explain something of what's been going on and how we can try and pull things together in a way that feels like a fresh beginning or a completion, depending on where that's affecting your chart and what's going on, obviously, in your own life. Now, with this South Node, K2, I'm going to call it, on the moon, we can find that, especially with the Libra Hasta connection here. And you'll also hear, by the way, Hasta nakshatra is with regards to the sidereal astrology. That's in the constellations, which is a separate feature compared to what is known as the Rashi or the zodiac that we use. It's not meant to be coupled with the signs. So you will hear some Indian or Vedic astrologers talking about Hasta nakshatra being in Virgo, but that's because they're coupling the constellations with the nakshatra. That's a whole different kettle of fish and a different discussion. I'm not going to go there, but just to say that it's going to be in the interpretation that I do with the zodiac according to the way that it was described in terms of how we should be creating a zodiac. It's based on the movements of the sun, and that's why we call that tropical astrology, which is the movement or the tropos of the sun and not the constellations. So this is something that I find gives very clear results. Having studied both systems, I find again and again that I get a lot more resonance with what is going on in the world around us and in our modern lives. So anyway, coming back to this Hasta nakshatra, it's really a good time for non-material goals and for realizations around your spiritual practice or creative things. Hasta is extremely good for creative things. Hasta means hand, and that's something that you know when you do mudra, for example, that's called Hasta mudra. When you're moving, doing symbols with your hands, that's Hasta mudra. This is Hasta nakshatra. And it's about a realization or an understanding of something that brings us to consciousness. And that's why, especially at all full moons, but especially this one, it's a really good time to be focusing on your spiritual goals, focusing on more esoteric or creative goals, and don't focus too strongly on the material side of your life, because with the south node there, it's not likely that things are going to come about as you had hoped. And this is quite true of all eclipses, because eclipses are a bit of a wild card. We're never really sure that things will come about in the way that we envisage them. Um, and if you're open to, being guided and feel like you're ready to jump into something new, there's no reason why you can't. It's just that you want to stay wide open and recognize that we're not in control of this rodeo, and that especially on the eclipse points, the things that we think we want, like especially through emotional connections, relationship connections, often turn out later on to not really be what we wanted. Um, Right. So I'll leave that with you there. Now, it can also be that sometimes relationships also disappear or fizzle out or separate, or with the South Node, this would depend on your chart. It's not just randomly because there's an eclipse happening that this would happen. But if your chart allows that, then with the South Node, when it encounters planets, important planets, you have an opportunity, or there is a potential for meeting somebody who you may have experienced in another lifetime, in a different experience of life. And that's for good or bad. That's not necessarily Prince Charming or Princess Charming or whatever she's called. Um, so just keep that in mind, that sometimes we are going to meet people who are very karmic at the times around the eclipses, and they are not things that you should necessarily feel you should cling to or stay attached to, because at the South Node, we're really trying to let things go. We're not trying to hang on, not trying to accumulate things, and that includes our emotions. So this is not a healthy time to stay focused or obsessed on emotional connections. And in fact, it's actually a really constructive time to move away from emotional connections. Like if you've had a breakup, and you've not been able to move on from that, when there is a moon near the South Node, it's an easier time to do that. This, of course, would depend on your natal chart, but the fact that we've had this moon just before the eclipse trining Pluto, it does also suggest that there's this readiness for something different. It's a readiness for something to transform and move on. Both the moon and Pluto are in air signs, and so that's also more rational or intellectual, or a little bit more light in terms of the energy and the energy circulating around emotions. And so it can also be a really good time to recognize that certain things you might be pushing against a locked door, for example, and realize, oh, I'm done with this. I don't need to keep going down this path. I'm done. And eclipses help a lot with that. Um, so ethical issues as well are really good around this time, when you're really working on dilemmas, issues of justice and fairness and so on. This is also Libra. Uh, and so there can be some really interesting outcomes based on higher ethics. And that again comes from Hasta interpretation, but it's also from the fact that it's a Libra placement in the sign. So things that happen around eclipse times are often very sort of sudden and unexpected. Um, and again, it's for good or bad, because we don't really know. I don't really like using good or bad in terms of whether things are going to have an outcome that you like or don't like, but we have to take what it is at the time that it's coming, because sometimes things that we want end up being a burden, or end up being something that is later on what we really don't want. And things that we at first glance don't feel like we want turn out to be actually an enormous blessing. And so everything is possible around eclipse time, and it's just really like a much more intense energy of a full moon. And full moons bring us emotionality, and that lunar trine to Pluto will also have been emotional around the time of this full moon. So as soon as you start to see the moon in the sky, you're already building up to this eclipse, this full moon eclipse, and that's usually a day and a half or two before the actual fullness of the moon. So you could say probably around the 23rd of March, depending on where you are, you'll be seeing the moon really, really bright in the sky. And this is already well within the range of the eclipse. And so If you do practice meditation, or if you do have things that you're wishing for or hoping to let go of, then this would be the time that you can already develop that. So that's the weekend before. The eclipse itself is on a Monday. And so you could think from the Saturday, Sunday, that that could be a really good use of your free time, and just really generate what it is that you're ready to move on from. The moon trining Pluto can be very helpful with that, along with the South Node eclipse. The other thing that's still lingering from the last few weeks is that the North Node in Aries is also continuing to be conjoining Chiron. Now, I give that a really generous 3 degrees. It's still in 3 degrees at the time of this eclipse. And very interesting, because that's again another message of healing and moving on, understanding identity, understanding oneself, and moving on from that as well. Just a couple of days, a few days actually, as it's the 21st of March, just before this eclipse, Venus and Saturn will have conjoined in Pisces. And the conjunction of Venus and Saturn is a whole new cycle for Venus and Saturn. It's roughly once a year. And this is really about getting clear in terms of our maturation around relationships, or our desire nature. And there again, there can be this feeling of stability, or a feeling of grounding something in reality, or grounding something in a feeling of peace or release. Again, if it's with relationship to material things, or to emotional or relational things, I see this as really helpful. So this is again in the build up towards the eclipse. But as I do this, this is actually the 6th of March. And so as I'm doing this, we do have this window which is already pretty much open into these eclipses. I think 2 weeks before and after each eclipse, it's really worth paying attention to what's going on, taking notes, even a couple of weeks on either side of that for certain things, depending on where your chart lines up with these things. If there are planets lining up really exactly, then you'll probably notice much more. I won't go through planet by planet, but the eclipse itself would be affecting anybody with the moon in Libra, anywhere, say, if we give it 3 degrees on either side, say from 2 of Libra all the way through 8 of Libra. And of course, by opposition, because that's what makes a full moon, it's the opposition to the sun in Aries, that would apply to Aries as well. So 2 degrees through to about 8 degrees of Aries. Now, you can extend that on either side. It's up to you how you use these ranges. 3 degrees, you will absolutely notice something very powerful happening. Now, again, this is also after the equinox, so on the 20th of March. So I always use universal time. So on the 20th of March, universal time, we're having the spring, or the Aries equinox, as Aries point is highlighted by the sun moving into Aries. And so this is also part of this eclipse energy, because we're still only at this point 5 degrees away from that. It's still a fresh, if you like, a fresh new year, a new solar year. And that means that the sun and Pluto have been in sextile also for a few days. So in the case of the moon, it's only a couple of hours, but in the case of the sun and Pluto, it's been a sextile for a few days already by this time. And that's a sign also of seriousness around change, and desire for something very different to take place, and a deep commitment, or a deep capacity to transform through whatever the solar aspect is in terms of your chart, or in terms of your relationship to the sun. That can be your career, for example, men in your life, important leaders, important men, and also issues around your identity, or your sense of purpose, if you like. We also have, at the time of this eclipse, a very, very tight, within 2 arc minutes of a degree, very tight semi-sextile between Pluto and Mars. And Mars is ruling the sun. And so this, oh, and I forgot to mention the Venus conjunct Saturn. Venus is exalted in Pisces. So again, very, very auspicious in terms of the outcome that we can find, the highest potential for Venus in terms of harmony, in terms of relationships, and so on. She's moving away from Saturn, so the restrictions are lessening as she's moving along much more quickly than Saturn. Restrictions are lessening, and she's the ruler of the moon at the time of this eclipse. So I just wanted to add that in there because I forgot to mention that in terms of the overall results of this kind of energy. I do think, again, that material results are not going to be easy to come by, but moral success and sort of spiritual success, metaphysical outcomes are very, very favored with all of this, with Venus in Pisces and moving away from Saturn, away from restriction, and also with the South Node moon. This can be a really strong regeneration around things that are, the most important things, the things that matter, the invisible things that matter the most. Anyway, let's come back to that Mars, which is ruling the North Node and ruling the Sun in a semi-sextile to Pluto. And that's where we recognize in the overall scheme of this chart that our personal, the meaning that we give things becomes very important. And this ties into what I was just saying about the more spiritual outcomes of things. So the metaphysical benefit that we can get from shedding some attachments, shedding material attachments, shedding ways of holding on, clinging on to things. And this semi-sextile between Mars and Pluto is it's a really strong impetus. It's when you really whatever your endeavors are at this time, whatever you're motivated by, is going to be supported by this, because it brings extra power, extra strength into anything that we want to achieve, as long as we really believe, as long as we feel this personal motivation. And so that you can also use in a way, along with that sextile between the Sun and Pluto, you can use that to empower yourself for whatever the thing is that you're ready to let go of or ready to dive into in the non-physical or the non-material plane. Right. And then, of course, we're building up to the Mercury retrograde. So the Mercury retrograde happens a week after, but Mercury is already in what is known as its shadow. And the Mercury shadow phase started on the 18th of March. And Mercury only actually gets up to, I think it's 26 or 27 degrees of Aries, and then it backs down all the way through until the 25th of April. So from the 1st of April until the 25th of April, Mercury is retrograde. So just notice the degree point here of Mercury. It's 23, 39, almost 24 degrees. And when it comes through 2 weeks later in the 8th of April eclipse, which I'll do separately as a video, that's only going to have got to 24 and a bit, so it's almost 25 degrees, but retrograde at that point. So Mercury is hovering around this particular point in Aries for quite some time. And this is also something very interesting, because what we're let's say, releasing at this time, what it is that we feel we're prepared to free ourselves up from, or what it is that we are ready to be surprised by, let's say, we are still not entirely sure about in terms of our intellect, or in terms of our communication, or in terms of our knowing what exactly we need to do with all of this. And so this is another reason why, on a material plane, it's not a great idea to launch something, to start something fresh or new. It's a good time to tie up loose ends and to move on from something, or to continue to go deeper into things that are already beginning, like things that you've already started before. For example, perhaps at the Libra new moon of 6 months before, that would have been also, that was an eclipse as well, and I'm just trying to find the date of that in my head. I didn't note it down. Anyway, I will put it in the comments below this video. And do check the comments below the video. There's usually some interesting things put in there as well. And that is where you will find information about how to look at the sun, moon, and rising as well. Right, so that Mercury is a big theme in the entire eclipse season through March and April. So take note of what's going on in the Aries part of your chart, even though the eclipse this time is happening in the Libra part of your chart. And then finally, we have Jupiter and Uranus building really now very tightly. Now they're 4.5 degrees apart of a conjunction in Taurus. And this is building very, very strongly from this point of the eclipse all the way through till early May. And of course, that is ruled by this exalted Venus in Pisces. Jupiter itself is ruling Pisces, ruling the Venus there. And so they're in a mutual reception. And they're also in a really supportive sextile. So not only are they in a mutual reception by sign, but they are in a very nice close sextile. And that also brings some kind of auspiciousness to this whole thing, where there can be some ease and some support and some sense of a higher, and again, I want to pull it up there as high as we can get, a higher minded way of looking at life, at the events of your life, at the world events, a higher minded way of understanding, in this case with Jupiter, what is wisdom? What are my values? What is important to me? How might I be able to enjoy my life with the Venus there in exaltation, in Pisces, ruled by that Jupiter. Venus having just checked in with Saturn, got her feet back on the ground just a wee bit, because she does tend to drift off in Pisces and love all of the romantic things and all of the pretty things. But Venus is just coming from a grounding, a good solid grounding through the Saturn. And so now as she's just moving away from this exact sextile a day before with Jupiter, she's in a really, really good position to uplift that Jupiter and vice versa. So, so definitely this is an opportunity to think big, think high-minded thoughts, think in terms of your own spiritual growth and spiritual development. Ketu as the south node is very much about spirit. It's the most perhaps spiritual planet of the wheel that we rely on regularly. Jupiter being one of the others, because Jupiter is about wisdom. It's about a higher mind. And then of course we've got Neptune, which is about compassion, but it's very difficult to navigate Neptune, because it can also be where we are not seeing clearly. So we have to keep our awareness grounded. And now this is where we come into the full moon too, where we have that sense of clarity. It's something that we become aware of, something that we may not have been aware of, or that we were kind of thinking of, kind of aware of. And that becomes much more clear through the full moon. There's a realization, an acknowledgement of something. So one challenge here that can be possible is that the Venus sextiling Jupiter can be a little over optimistic, and there can be a sense of maybe pie in the sky kind of thinking. But somehow I think with the Mars and Pluto in a semi-sextile, really within 2 arc minutes of a semi-sextile at the time of the eclipse, I think we have enough grounding in terms of a challenge where we feel like we're up for the challenge. Pluto sextiling the sun, we're determined and we're up for a challenge. And so whatever, if there is some kind of pie in the sky thinking, it won't last long, because K2 will deal with that. K2 will be the arbiter finally of whatever whatever needs to change. So surrender is the key word here. Surrender, letting go. Feel that you are ready to move on. And the only way that we can move on is through a growth in our spiritual attitude to life. And that has nothing to do with your religious belief. On the contrary, it's actually what is your meaning and purpose? What is your life? What does that represent? And what values do you live your life by? which may or may not align with any particular religion. So let me just check my notes to make sure that I've touched on all these things before we go. I kind of said it, but the loss of egoic desire is part of the moon and south node connection. Again, very spiritual energy. And so it can be something that happens uh, suddenly by surprise, by through outer events, or it can be something that you feel building inside, and that may have been building over the previous couple of weeks since the previous new moon, which was the 10th of March in Pisces, or it can be something that is building over the last 6 months, for example, since the previous new moon in Libra. So this is an opportunity to surrender, and surrendering doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean collapsing. It means recognizing that there is a bigger force out there that knows how to make flowers grow, and it knows how to allow you to breathe even when you're sleeping. And that's the energy that I trust. And so even when things don't work out for us on this everyday material plane, trust that actually there's a bigger plan and there's something that we're going to grow through and enjoy as we go through life by letting go of the clinging, of the letting go of the idea things have to be a particular way.